Welcome, everyone, to this panel hosted by Uri Litzedek on mental health in the Jewish community. We're joined here today with four panelists, luminaries each. The first person I'd like to introduce you today is Dr. Michelle Friedman, who received her MD from the NYU School of Medicine and has completed advanced training at the Columbia University Psychoanalytic Center for Training and Research. She is a highly respected psychiatrist who focuses on the Jewish community and has a special interest in the rabbinate and pastoral counseling. In addition to her private practice and her role at YCT Rabbinical School, where she holds the Stephen and Sharon Lieberman Chair in Pastoral Counseling, Dr. Friedman is Associate Professor of Clinical Psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York. She, together with Dr. Rachel Yehuda, are the authors of The Art of Jewish Pastoral Counseling, a guide for all faiths, published by Routledge in 2016. Next, we have Benjamin Lichtman, a musician, artist, and graphic designer. Ben was recently the chief creative officer at the Tshuva Center in New York City. He manages the Emergency Project, a nonprofit organization providing emergency medicine services and resources to underserved communities around the world. Ben is also a multi-instrumentalist, playing in a variety of genres. Ben holds a bachelor's in music composition from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and brings his recovery experience to inform and shape how he serves others so they can find their own life of healing. Gabriela Lupatkin is the clinical director at Bamidbar, a Jewish organization aimed at supporting mental health and wellness of teens and young adults. Gabriela is devoted to supporting Jewish teens and young adults through mental health care, Jewish identity development, and community education. She focuses her work on direct clinical practice, supervising early career mental health providers, and expanding access to mental health services. She's also a registered yoga teacher with specialized training in health and mental health yoga. Finally, we have Mark Fine, a leadership coach, educational consultant, and mental health advocate with over a decade of work of experience of creating interactive workshops that have empowered thousands of individuals and organizations, Fortune 500 companies, and community nonprofits with practical tools to actualize their potential on their teams and in their lives. He has a master's in nonprofit management and leadership from Hebrew University and is certified in youth mental health first aid, as well as experiential Jewish education. He previously worked as a speechwriter for Yeshiva University and regional director of NCSY. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, at least on the East Coast of the United States. I'd like to start off by asking Mark, if you could share your mental health journey with us, we'd be grateful.
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Uri Litzedek and Rabbi Weinbach, for gathering this particular panel together. After hearing the intros, I'm that much more excited to hear everybody else's stories and perspectives on a topic that is always important, but feels especially relevant and resonant at this moment in history. My name is Mark Fine. I'm calling in from Jerusalem, Israel. Grew up in New York. We'll say there are the two stories I like to say of Mark Fine. There's the classic resume story. That's the Sarah Elementary, Ramaz for high school, gap year, Yeshiva University, Jewish nonprofit. I was supposed to be a lawyer, but then jumped to Jewish nonprofit early on. Part of that other classic story, and we can go through the resume life. And then there is also what I would call the mental health story. And that was the experience with anxiety and depression, which I didn't know how to label at the time because, fun fact, I look young, I'm actually 38. So when I was in high school and college, mental health wasn't really a thing yet. And I didn't have a language to describe my own experience at that time, let alone skills or tools to cope with it. And it took me until my mid-20s and a lot of life journeys, which is not for the 3-minute introduction, to discover that, well, this is my life and my journey, and I needed help and needed support. Eventually got it, but through that, discovered how many other people also didn't have a language to put to their own experience, didn't know how to ask for support. And back in, we'll say, 2014, 2015, or as I like to say, before it was cool to talk about mental health, ended up involved in an art exhibit at Yeshiva University called the What I Be Project, where I posted a photo on the internet on back then it was still the Facebook, talking about my own mental health experience. And I didn't think anyone would actually see it. Surprise, people see things on the internet. And it went mini viral at the time, which led to me speaking publicly about my experience with anxiety and depression as part of Active Minds at Yeshiva University. And that became the start of sharing lived experience as a way of breaking the stigma around mental health at synagogues, at schools, and then eventually that turned into as a non-mental health professional, which I think is important to add because we will be hearing from mental health professionals later on in the panel, that everyone has their own role to play. And I found that the role that I was able to play was how can I speak from the perspective of someone who might currently be suffering or going through something, provide words to that experience, and then through that, either A, give them the permission to seek help from someone who is a mental health professional who could support them in the professional way that they need, um, or give them some practical tools that supported me that I now have the credibility to say, hey, these are things that might have worked for me. This could work for you. Or people felt more comfortable coming over to me because they felt as if, oh, I get it and see it from their perspective without the judgment to then be able to then, okay, so what if we went together too? Which, especially in a school context or a work context, a lot of people were looking for that permission and that language and something practical that wasn't at that moment pathologizing or wasn't at that moment stigmatizing or looking down on. And since this is a Jewish context, I'll conclude with the whole idea of Vayechu Shnehem Yachdav. Like, what does it mean to walk with someone? And I think a lot of times what people are looking for in these situations is who can see me for where I am and who's willing to walk with me through this. And I think that's really what my journey has been, was starting at that loneliness and then finding the people who are able to guide me and then hopefully being able to serve as a guide to walk with others in the way that I'm able to contribute to their particular mental health journeys.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for sharing, first of all, sharing your story, and also thank you for your decision to try to walk with the other people in our community. I know that that's a service that we really need. Next, I'd like to call on Ben. Ben, could you talk to us about your story?
Sure, absolutely. Mark, thank you for sharing. Appreciate it. And Ellie, thank you for having me. And I have to say, also, just after hearing the introductions, really just such an honor to have been asked to be a part of this panel. So thank you, Elliot, Elliot Tzedek, for having me today. My mental health journey is long. It's it started very young. I think that I was one of those kids that I burned really hot, right out of the gate. I was just full of energy and full of excitement, and that led to me maybe being interested in things that were perceived as dangerous and not beneficial for myself and for my family, for sure. And it was exciting. I remember the feeling of being young and being wide-eyed, and I was extremely creative. I love to draw. I love to put things together. I would go outside and I would build sculptures with rocks and sticks, and I saw a lot of beauty in the world. And there was something in me that it always felt like a struggle to kind of find my place and to fit in to different groups of people. I always felt like an outsider, and I always kind of felt like there was this pressure to fit into this round shaped hole that I was the square that I just didn't lock in. And that was always something that was frustrating. And at an early age, it's actually funny because Mark mentioned my voice at the beginning of this, and he said, Ben, you sound exactly like what I thought you would sound like. And I thought that was really funny because when I was young, I lived in Israel actually until I was 5 years old. So when I moved back to New Jersey with my parents, I was only speaking Hebrew. And when I started speaking English, I had a lot of that like throat pronunciation from the Hebrew. And they were concerned that I was damaging my vocal cords by the way that I spoke. And so I started seeing a speech therapist in the 3rd grade. And it turned out that speech therapist abused me. And it was really unfortunate. And I'm not saying that, Mark, to make you feel bad. It's just like, it's funny how it's like the through line to like, yeah, my voice is very particular, but also there was this moment in my life where that led me into a situation that was harmful. And so I didn't react obviously well to that. And I was diagnosed with ADHD. I was prescribed Ritalin at around I was like 9 or 10 years old. And at that time, I feel like maybe it was still early in the days of the ADHD Ritalin culture. This was like maybe 1991. And I was heavily prescribed, and I had adverse reactions to be prescribed to Ritalin. I wasn't eating. I wasn't really speaking. It was very much just like I was in this like catatonic state, but overactive mind, and it was really an awkward kind of place to live within my body. Um, and it progressed from there. Other diagnoses started popping up and different medications were prescribed, and there was more issues in school, and I was seeing social workers, and I was seeing therapists, and I was being suspended, and I got expelled from high school, and it was just like there was a lot of issues. And about 14 years old, just from hanging out with the neighborhood kids, I started experimenting with different drugs, and I started smoking weed and drinking and taking acid and eating mushrooms, and really anything you could think of, I would try. And it was exciting for me, especially being a creative. I really loved the hallucinogens at a young age because I would go and I would have a psychedelic experience, and I would create, and I would write music, and I would just kind of, I felt like I would return from these experiences with like real life lessons answered, but it would only last for like an hour because then I would forget all of it and just move forward back into my daily routine. Which is interesting now that you see kind of this movement of therapy using plant medicines and being able to kind of continue with those revelations that you have in psychedelic experiences and actually implementing that into your life. But at that time, there was no one guiding me, and I was taking way too many, like way more than I should have been. But nothing had ever really worked. And I ended up getting expelled from high school. I was sent to a youth psychiatric hospital. I was cleared to go back. They allowed me back into school, and I graduated. And I just kind of became this like wayward soul. I left Jersey. I went to LA just like on a whim. I had no money. I had no job. I was sleeping on some random person's couch. They kicked me out. I found a group of people, and ultimately I was introduced to heroin. And that started, a decade of madness. And, I don't need to get into all the details, but it was, 10 years of homelessness, arrests, institutions, mental health centers, rehabs, jails, and death. I've OD'd a few times. And it was really very much a struggle. And so here in New York, my parents went and they saw a play at the 92nd Street Y called Freedom Song, which was being presented by this organization called Bet Shuva, which was in LA. And so my mom calls me. She's like, Ben, I got to tell you, there's this place, Jewish in LA. It's called Bet Shuva. You need to check them out. And so I was like, okay. And I did go to college, and I graduated college with a horrible heroin addiction, and it was a mess. And I took my finals in a psych ward, and it was like this whole thing. So this was post-college. And so I end up calling Bet Shuva. I'm homeless in New York. They say, listen, get to a detox. We'll figure it out from there. So I get to detox. Bet Shuva figures out, they get me a plane ticket, they fly me to LA. I go and I'm introduced to like the most incredible community of just like wayward souls like myself, just like Jews from all walks of life and perspectives and beliefs and backgrounds. And it was just this community that was just full of love and acceptance. And just like they just told me, like, we just want you to be you. Like, just come and be the authentic you. We don't want none of the mask. We don't want any of the hiding. Like, feel free to be yourself and be honest with us. And that, from that moment forward, I left there and I really tapped into creativity as a means of enhancing my recovery and actually experiencing spirituality through the creative process. And so I took that, I moved home, I started a music school, and I was building music programs for schools around New York City that didn't have music. And then one of the rabbis from Tshuva Center called me one day out of the whim, and he said, "Hey, I'm moving to New York City. You know, would you want to start Bet Shuva essentially on the East Coast?" And, you know, I dropped everything I was doing, and that really started my journey on creating a community of people with, you know, based in Jewish tradition, but open to everybody, where we can just come and, right, not feel the need to fit in, but just to belong somewhere in the true sense of who we are. And just like Mark said, being able to speak from my personal experience, and just, if that could just one person can just say, oh my God, I can relate to what you've been through. You know, you are the hope that I need to make it through this day, was all we really were trying to do, right? Is just find what it meant to create a real community that was based in love, connection, hope. And we did it, you know, and I'm still continuing now through with the founding of Sela, which myself and Ariel and Jeremy are doing. And it's just been such a blessing and such an amazing experience to be able to build this, and to just see, to be able to see someone come in hopeless and watch the lights turn on in their eyes, right? You just see you just see it click. That gets me through. Yeah, that's it. That's what I got.
Thanks so much for sharing, Ben. It's a powerful story, and really one that is ending on some real inspiration. So I appreciate that. This is a question for everyone. I'd love if you could each just take a couple minutes to tell us about your work in the Jewish community. Let's start with Gabriella.
Hi, everyone. What a two stories to follow. Thank you so much for sharing all of that, both of you. Yeah, so just to talk a little bit about sort of what we do in the Jewish community. I think a lot of, Benjamin, what you were saying with Beit Shuva, I think is a lot of similar goals that we have at Bamidbar. We draw, as an organization, we draw on the wisdom of Judaism, of community building, and we try to work with really the whole community as well as the individual. So what that looks like for us is we do both. We do a lot of community work and we do a lot of clinical work. So the community work involves working, with what we talk about, the ecosystem of support. So we're talking about working with schools, synagogues, camps, really seeing the whole picture of who might be supporting a young person. And we, in a lot of our educational programming, we draw from Jewish thought, Jewish wisdom, and also just the nature of working within the Jewish community. And then we also work clinically, individually with teens and young adults and sometimes their families. And the goal is not at all to sort of push any type of Jewish agenda or connection to whatever, a specific type of Jewish identity, but to really help people understand that there's space for them in the Jewish community with whatever it is they're struggling with, or community building or what have you. So we don't just work with the Jewish population. We tend to work primarily in the Jewish community. But that's a little bit about what we do and how we serve the Jewish community, and hopefully building connections with, I believe actually that somebody from my organization had a conversation with somebody from Sela. So that, and I mentioned that just to say that's part of what we're doing too, is to really bridge gaps, really work with the Jewish community. Exactly. Yeah. So that's our hope as well. and for that people to understand that this is a goal of the Jewish community. And I think we'll probably get into some conversation around stigma, but really that the organized Jewish community sees this as a really important goal, and that we are doing a lot of work in community building around it.
Thank you, Gabriella. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The organizational Jewish world definitely still has a few more steps to take on this, and I appreciate you pushing them. Dr. Friedman, could you please share with us your work in the Jewish community?
Okay, so my work with the Jewish community is primarily with rabbis. And about 25 years ago, I was invited to join the faculty of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah to start a pastoral counseling program. So when I got that invitation, I didn't know what was that. And I looked around at other Jewish seminaries and also Christian seminaries, and found out that at the end of like around 1999, there wasn't much going on at all, which was really quite stunning, because clergy of all faith traditions are first responders to people's human needs. And it doesn't matter if people are religious, if they're super secular. When something comes up, a crisis, like we're talking today, for example, about addiction, a marriage, a birth, a death, an illness, something like that, people zoom into clergy, and clergy are shockingly unprepared, and have not learned tools and techniques to deal with their own anxiety, to deal with basic principles of recognizing mental illness, distress, addiction, as was just talked about, etc. So I started building this program at YCT, which was really the goal was to train people as competent first responders, that rabbis were going to go out into the field in any capacity, whether they were going to have pulpits, conventional pulpits, startups, pop-ups pulpits, educators, people who were going to work in institutional settings as chaplains, meaning mostly hospitals or prisons or other kinds of things, would have the basics of understanding kind of core principles of shutting up and listening to other people, taking their own emotional pulse, being aware of what's going on in themselves, and also recognizing basic principles of mental health and mental illness. So that was the goal. And 25 years later, I'm really proud to say that there are many dozens, scores of rabbis out there who I think are the best that they can be. Their goal was not to make them into junior psychotherapists or psychoanalysts, but to make them the best rabbis they can be. And all of our guys have been through the program, which includes a full summer, 400 hours, and as working in a hospital, generally speaking, a hospital, doing CPE, clinical pastoral education. And I think that this has rendered them really so much more capable of interfacing with people of all ages, college students, and we're going to get to what's roiling the world right now, but on campuses, elders, people who are ill, young parents, kids, etc. So that's the main of what I do. I was really honored to write this up with Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who, apropos of psychedelics, is one of the guddles, the experts in that health field. Maybe we'll get to in the book that was mentioned earlier. And that does lead to a little bit of speaking and public engagement, with the Jewish community, talking about areas that are stigmatized. But I think we'll get to that later. So I'll stop for now.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. And I just want to say thank you on a personal level. Going through YCT's rabbinical program, I've learned a tremendous amount from you. So I appreciate the work that you've done, for me in my journey, and for all my classmates and everyone else who's graduated from YCT. I think it's a real help to the Jewish community. Let's go with Mark. Mark, what are you doing in the Jewish community these days?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that in two ways, just because I think it's particularly relevant for this panel, is what I started doing and what it's evolved into, because I think it's a different lens on this conversation. I started in this work very much in I'm the depression guy who's sharing my story and what does it mean to live with. And it got heavy. And after a few years, whether I grew out of it, burnt out of it, got tired of being labeled as the depression guy, or somewhere along that realm, sort of switched into what I'll call mental health adjacent, as opposed to mental health direct, into more of the coaching, more of the staff training, more of the if we're running training for advisors or madrichim or counselors over the summer, the role plays and the practical tools and skills, and a lot more of the we'll call compassion, empathy, active listening, and everything to do with what I'll call mental health and wellness, and creating authentic, caring, and empowering spaces, but a lot less of the mental illness space. And I bring that up just because I think it's an interesting transition as someone who isn't a professional in the field. What does that journey and engagement look like? And I'll also add, just from what I've been hearing from other people, when I first started talking and presenting, the reaction was, wow, I've never heard anyone like this before. 10 years later, it's, oh, I've heard this speech from someone else or from the media or from whatever. And like oh, now we're talking about it isn't as necessary as it used to be. And if anything, I think the pendulum is now swinging in the opposite direction of everyone self-diagnosing, over pathologizing, over, oh, I must have all the following things. And what are we normalizing almost another direction? And watching that transition has been fascinating, while obviously recognizing what Dr. Friedman said, which is spot on, that everyone who is a professional, as an educator and as a rabbi in this field, there's some fundamentals that need to be in place, and that continued training and sensitivity and support and awareness is critical.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I appreciate the move from a talking position to a position where you're really educating, you're really doing the work or helping other people do the work in a good way. That's great. Ben, what are you doing? What's Sela up to?
So Sela is so essentially we're still a young organization, but with the three of us all come from quite a history and backgrounds in the work of mental health and addiction. Each one of us have our story and the work that led us up to meeting and the beginning this. But essentially what we're doing now is we want to build, right? We really are focusing on this idea of community, right? And that this is where recovery happens in the best and most supportive ways. So we're thinking of it as participation celebrated. Like, we want people to come and engage and be around, even if maybe you're not identifying as somebody who might be an alcoholic or somebody that's struggling with mental health. We look at it from the perspective of this is a family issue. So if there's one person in a family unit that's struggling, it affects everybody. So we're not limited to just it's this person and you're the identified patient, but it's you and it's the people in your life that love you and care about you, and how we can support everybody as a unit and move forward and make sure that everybody is kind of getting the support they need, because it's difficult. When you're watching somebody that you love that's struggling, you may not have the tools necessary to be able to support them in the way that they need. It's also everyone welcoming. So yes, we do work through a Jewish lens, but we're not limited to just Jewish people. It can be anybody who wants to engage in what we have to say and the way that we teach things. For instance, Jeremy is not Jewish, but he found his recovery in a Jewish community. And I always tell him he's a better Jew than me. He's like, oh, the Parsha of the week is that. I'm like, I have no idea what Parsha it is this week. So he's like, it's really funny to see that. But we really believe in that it's, we are not pushing any type of dogmatic or religious perspective on people. It's really taking the spiritual principles that we find within the Torah, and we believe that, right, we can find ourselves in our own story within the teachings of Judaism, and that can apply to anybody, Jew and non-Jew alike. Well, we come from different backgrounds. We have people that are in 12-step. We have some people that just grew up around people who struggled with addiction. There are some of us that are recovering, have our own experiences in recovery and challenges that we can share that have changed us. And our foundational belief is that recovery really is for everybody. and that we love to provide a space and a place in a community where people get it, where you're seen and you're heard and you're understood. That's really important for us. So, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Ben. Getting into current events, Dr. Friedman, how do you see the current moment of conflict? And I'll be explicit this one time, we're talking about the war in Israel and in Gaza. How do you see this moment of conflict affecting rabbis in the field? And what should community leaders be particularly aware of during wartime pastoral encounters?
Okay, so, in thinking about this, I was just paying attention to some of the phrases that Mark and Ben used earlier today, because I'm going to set this up that I think that the current conflict and the issues that rabbis and leaders face butts up hard against these principles. So Mark used a beautiful phrase of walking a journey together. And Ben, you just emphasized really beautifully community and how wayward souls could find a community that was full of love and be, encouraged to be themselves. And I think what I'm trying to get at, the current conflict is smashing that, because people are feeling deeply divided as communities, as Jews. What does it mean to be a Jew? If you're a good Jew, are you a loyal Zionist? If you're a Zionist, does that mean you support everything the state of Israel does? Can you criticize some things? Can you support aspects of the conflict and be loyal to Israel and also feel compassion for the suffering that's going on the part of Gazan citizens? All of these things, can you demonstrate in one demonstration and also feel sympathy with another? So this is really fracturing the Jewish community. I mean, maybe not in the main, but not so much well, it depends on the different communities, depending on, I suppose, political and whatever religious political persuasions. But in contrast to something, for example, like COVID, where maybe there was a lot of internal dissent about how COVID conscious you were going to be and whether or not you were going to have a Seder together or not. Nobody was really debating whether COVID was a good or a bad thing. Here, the fundamental issues and especially between, this often comes across in generational divides. So I had a lot of requests to be on panels before Passover, because people were very concerned about families being able to be civil or to be together, for a Seder, when the general expectation was, not always conforming this way, that the younger generation was going to be more oppositional and critical of Israel, and the older generation was going to feel, wait, don't these people understand Jewish persecution? Don't they understand the need for the land of Israel, et cetera, et cetera? So I think that the task for rabbis is very painful, because rabbis are expected to help hold communities together, to create dialogue space, to help people be civil together. They can have a shul dinner, they can daven together, they can discuss issues, they can have a group go to the Israel Day parade, whatever it's going to be. And in trying to deal with these very divided communities, rabbis also have their own internal conflicts about the state of affairs. And so in terms of taking their own emotional pulses and being true to themselves while trying to hold communities together is a very, very difficult task. And I think this extends all the way from people's seders in their comfortable homes, to going on missions to Israel, to signing on to letters, to having different panels, to talking about kids in college and what's going on. So I would say this is a deeply painful time, one of the most painful times that I've seen for rabbis and community leaders. And I think we all have to really be supportive and I'm just looking at my notes here, to walk together and stay as a community during this tough time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Friedman, and thanks for your work helping the rabbis help the communities stay together. Ben, how do you see the current moment of conflict, or maybe conflict in general? How does that interact with recovery work?
Sure. Within recovery spaces, a foundational tenet is staying focused on the internal work, and that the inner work allows us to function and to thrive in a world that once was too hard for us to manage. And so I always say to people, you know, the world and people in it don't change. When we enter recovery, we're the ones that change. Um, and so that being said, you know, one of my favorite aspects of being in recovery communities is that you're offered opportunities to share spaces with people that you might not ordinarily seek out in your day-to-day life. And you know, you'll find yourself in rooms of people that have completely different views politically, socially, economically. But there's the common thread and this pursuit of a higher mission that exists. And so right at this moment within the Jewish community, the conflict is extremely polarizing. And there's Jews that stand on every side of this issue. Um, and at Sella, the community that we're building and that we see show up is it's really open and it's really inclusive to when we're talking about the Jews that show up. It's from all backgrounds and beliefs. So we have like from the super Orthodox to the really liberal, and everything in between. So there's very strong opinions and feelings that come up, and you know, as all things, there's appropriate times and places for these things to be discussed. Within spaces focused on recovery, bringing these things up can be really distracting and even detrimental to the healing and what you're trying to do. And of course, it has come up time to time in groups that I've been running, and I've seen, you know, really heated debate over the conflict, and it's hijacked a meeting, right? It's shifted the purpose of the meeting from recovery to this political argument. And I'm not trying to diminish the significance of what's happening right now, especially for being a Jew and finding your place and kind of being in that, like, well, if I'm this, am I also this? Like, can two things be true at the same time? Or, you know, do I have to draw this line in the sand and I'm on this team or I'm on that team? But even before this, it's like there's always going to be something that people want to hang their hat on. And in recovery spaces, if we're taking time to focus on these things, we are distracting from what the intended goal is, which is fostering that connection and that growth in that community. So, all that being said, yes, it's challenging, but yes, there's always challenges when it comes to discussing recovery. And there's always going to be these things that separate us. And it's like, for me, what I always like to bring people back to is let's find what brings us together, what we can find in common, and let's forget about what separates us, because we're going to do this in community, right? We cannot do this alone. So it's vital that we're able to keep that alive in these rooms. So yeah, but it has really been challenging.
Thanks, Ben. Mark, how has the current conflict affected the work that you're doing, and how have you responded to emergent needs in Israel?
Yeah, so my answer is going to be a little bit different because I live in Israel, lived in Jerusalem, obviously was in Israel on October 7th. And immediately afterwards, um, every community was affected, and yet every community was affected differently. So, for example, I made Aliyah, moved to Israel when I was already 35. I moved after the age of enlistment, we'll call it. So I wasn't going to the army. A lot of friends that were. Um, I didn't have a spouse that was going to the army. I didn't have kids that were in the army. I lived in Jerusalem as an Anglo, and if some of you might know the neighborhood specifically of Baca, people were asking me, "Oh, Mark, what's it like living in Israel in a war zone?" And I would say, "Well, if you've been to Baca recently, you wouldn't necessarily know that something was going on. You would for lots of other reasons, which probably aren't for this call. But in terms of the most visceral impact, everyone's affected differently, and there's a guilt that can come with that, and also okay, so where can I help? Where can I contribute? And one of the things that I was personally limited by was not having a mental health degree. And there were posts everywhere about the mental health needs in Israel at the moment, whether it was um, partners who were serving at war, whether it's PTSD, whether it's soldiers afterwards, and that wasn't anything that I could contribute to, because the first thing they would ask was, well, like, do you have a mental health degree? And the space where I was able to find myself was actually within the Anglo community, um, in our particular Jerusalem community, because they had their own unique stressors. Again, the point isn't to compare, because immediately, like, oh, but it doesn't compare to their stressors were also legitimate, because a lot of them, their stressor was, oh, do I stay in Israel or do I go home to the States or to England? And how do I even feel about the fact that I have that choice and other people don't? Or managing the guilt of, I'm here and I want to contribute, but I don't feel like I'm contributing the way that other people are contributing. Or there's this really stressful situation because this is my quote unquote first war in Israel, and I don't know how to manage the stress that I have. And one of the places where I was able to contribute was in our particular local synagogue, and then we had a couple of local groups afterwards. We created a community for people to come and just share and feel community and have a space where people could download and know that they'd be validated for it, to learn a couple of practical, we'll call it anxiety management skills, whether that was box breathing, whether that was what's the smallest thing that I can do right now to keep momentum going, whether that was identifying who's the person I can call for connection, um, to help teach those practical tools. And I think for a lot of people, after that initial destabilization that occurred, they needed a space, at least in the moment, to feel anchored in some way, whether it's to another person, whether it's to a group, whether it's to an institution. And then that became a foundation for them, or an expansion of their toolkit to navigate the ongoing stresses of what was going on. Um, and it's ongoing. I wish I could say, "Hey, Rabbi Weinbach, here's the pretty bow on how we're," like, even the question is hard because you're asking about emergent, and the joke that I like to tell is people talking about PTSD, except the P stands for present, not post, and it's a constant navigation of, where am I? Where do I want to be? Where's the community? Should I feel guilty about the fact that I'm focused on, in that case, at the time, my pregnant wife, as opposed to focus on the broader community because of what she, and these are the questions that come up. And hopefully through the conversations we were able to have in our community and those skills, that people are able to navigate them in an honest and building way. Um, and that is the end of my non-answer. That is ongoing and emergent.
I definitely see that as an answer. And yeah, thanks for, being on the ground and doing the work there. That is, does not sound easy to me. Gabriella, how do you see this conflict affecting teen mental health? And where do you think some support for that could be?
Yeah, so we're definitely seeing a rise in, anxiety, depression, a lot of fear. We actually launched our clinical services in September. So our kind of pre-October 7th existence doesn't really exist because it was Chagim, and it was quite a time for us. And I think, like Mark was describing, we pivoted a lot of our services to sort of that type of like support group style. And so we were doing actually the groups that were more attended were groups that were really focused on supporting that ecosystem of support. And so I'll talk a little bit about sort of the various ways in which this has shown up for us. But we're seeing a lot of young people feeling really isolated and scared, early symptoms of anxieties that have maybe been worked through, reoccurring. And I think one of the really important pieces that we're seeing is this piece about identity, really. Being a teen and young adult, this is really the developmental stage is all about identity formation. And I think everybody else on the panel was talking about sort of what this means to our identities as a Jew, as a Zionist, as a not a Zionist, whatever it is. And so teens are really needing to grapple with this in a way that they probably didn't feel in the same way prior to October 7th. So it's really showing up in that way as well. So on the clinical side, we're definitely seeing a lot of people looking for support therapy to help with some of this symptomology, some of the dynamics, their work dynamics, their school dynamics, different things that are coming up. And then on the I'll talk about like kind of the ecosystem of support side. We've been doing a lot of work with schools and camps and synagogues and things like that. And we're just seeing a lot of burnout on on part of the professionals. And I think, Dr. Friedman, you were talking about this with the rabbinate. A lot of professionals are really feeling overwhelmed that they don't have, they're being asked to have answers that they don't have. They're being asked to support students and young people in a way that they haven't before. And I think they're still dealing with the ramifications of COVID. And this is another sort of major crisis that is hitting the Jewish community. And, some of this is it gets complicated, especially in the summer, because this is also, so camp counselors are youth themselves while they're also being asked to lead and care for the wellness and well-being of people younger than they are. And a lot of camps and schools as well, but are having people come directly from Israel. So initially it was students, the day schools were having Israeli families moving. We saw a lot of families move to Boston. I'm based in Boston. And a lot of students moving here, looking for extra support. A lot of camps are having counselors and staff coming in from Israel and sort of not really knowing what that will look like, but needing support. And so we're seeing this sort of impact a whole swath of the Jewish community. And we're in some ways, building the plane as we drive it, so to speak. And in other ways, there's more history there, but it's really impacting teens and the communities of people who support them on so many different levels. There was something else that I was going to say that has slipped my mind now, but if it comes back to me, I'll bring that up. But that is a lot of what we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gabriella. And also thanks for calling our attention to the compounding crises at this moment and the difficulty of working through that. I think the next question that I'm going to ask everyone is what work is being done to destigmatize mental health conversations in the Jewish community, and how can we help with that? And just as I think I, like Mark, I was at Yeshiva University and a while ago, and at that time we were starting to move towards mental health destigmatization, I think. But I will say, in response to what Dr. Friedman was saying, my mashgiach ruchani there did not have, I don't think, this sort of knowledge. The person who I went to talk about the crisis that I was having about putting on tefillin every day, putting on tzitzis every day, did not have a framework for talking to me definitely not in a destigmatized way. I don't know how they were thinking about it, but they definitely didn't approach the question in a pastoral way. And I think that did probably a lot of harm to sort of the way that I interact with the Orthodox Jewish community. So let's start, I think, with Dr. Friedman. What can we do to destigmatize this conversation?
I'm going to just tell my own story, because how I kind of got my start in pastoral counseling, I was always interested in the interface between my Jewish interest and my psychiatric and psychoanalytic education. But what happened was I was studying at Drisha, and there was a suicide of a very beloved and revered teacher at the institution. And the community was really in shock. And my chavrut at the time and I, she was also a mental health adjacent person, started just talking. And a couple of months later, we put together the first, I think it was really the first, it was in 1997, of these community-wide forums. It was called Wrestling with Despair, a Jewish response to anxiety and depression. And we had no idea how many people were going to come. We had two scholars talking about whatever, depression, suicide in Tanakh, etc., and 2 clinicians. And it was in a pretty big space. And wow, like maybe 200 plus people came. We had no idea what was going to be. And it was really profound, the need that's happened, that was demonstrated. And since then, I think, especially obviously with the internet, where people have access to so much more information, and there can be so much more nimble about setting up support groups or panels. Now, this can go in not helpful directions. And, as was talked about earlier, the kind of over pathologizing of people's life experience can also be not so helpful. But I definitely think that establishing forums, panels, discussion groups that have a structure to them, that have a beginning and an end, that have a time definition, that have maybe a facilitator who doesn't have to be the world's expert in the subject, but on whatever the thing happens to be, whether it's healthy eating or psychedelic journeys or reactions, help for suicide survivors, or whatever the thing is, teens in distress. I think that convening these kinds of discussion groups is really the way to go. And I think that when somebody in authority convenes it with the help of people who know it from the inside out, which are clearly represented in today's panel, I think that's a great thing. And I think the more that educators and rabbis can do this, not necessarily linked to a specific tragedy, or just certainly not to a person's name, it's incredibly helpful. Postpartum depression, for example, was an area that I spent a lot of time on in my career. And that moved from really being in the shadows with, like, thank you, Brooke Shields and Tom Cruise. You couldn't buy that kind of publicity. So I think it really helped. And again, I think that we've moved almost too much into an era of everybody is traumatized, past and present and future and whatever. But you know what? The pendulum swings. And I think better to have more knowledge and awareness than less.
Thank you very much, Dr. Friedman. Gabriella, what can we do to destigmatize?
Yeah, I think that I'd have to agree with that. And I think continuing these conversations, one of the things that we do in our work with organizations is that we are seeing a lot of organizations really care about this issue, and they're learning more about it. And we've run cohort-based programs to help these different institutions really think about mental health and sort of, I think what Mark was talking about, I think it was Mark, about that sort of mental health adjacent piece of things. And so you don't have to be a mental health provider to really be thinking about someone's mental health and how to support them in a school, in a camp, in a synagogue, et cetera. And so I think one of the things we can do as both mental health and non-mental health professionals is continue to learn about all of this. And I love that this is, Rabbi Weinbach, you're a rabbi having this conversation. And so having this conversation, from leadership in the Jewish community, being able to learn what things are, the things that we don't know, learning that, and then being able to refer, being able to adjust forms, the things that we might not think about, that the way you fill out a form can really have an impact on someone, the way that a classroom is set up, where the door is of a classroom, where how recess looks, all of these different things, when we think about it from a different angle, we really can do so much. So I would definitely love to see conversations like this exist, and for all professionals and family members to really continue to learn how they can best support each other. And I love, Benjamin, what you had said before, the work of Cell. It's not just about the individual, that, it's not about the identified patients, the whole family, it's a whole community. And so we can't just look at the one person who's struggling and say, you have to get better and you have to do this, but it's really what we all do as a community. And I think that will be kind of ultimately what really helps make a difference.
Thanks. Ben, what do you think about destigmatization? What can we do?
Yeah, I like to call it the Shonda factor, but it's one in this room right now. There are all of us together. We have, right, from the teens and the young adults, we have the depression piece, we have the rabbinical piece, we have the training of the clergy and the rabbis, right? We have the community piece. And it's when we look at all of these things, and for us, it's just like looking at the human experience and ending the pathology of it, right? And focusing on the idea of we're all human and we all make mistakes and we all struggle. And it's like how Gabriella just brought that up. It's not the identified patient. It's leading people to understand that one, this is not a moral failing, right? It's not like we're bad people, right? We're good people that are going through hard times, or that maybe don't have the tools or the frameworks to get through these things, and help just build that understanding of what it means to struggle, how it affects all of us, and finding ourselves, right? As we find ourselves in the Torah, how do we find ourselves within this spectrum of mental health and struggle and growth? And I think that for Sela and for how we manage to try and break the Shonda factor is, one, leading by example and just saying, hey, this is what a Jewish community that is focused on this thing is doing, and look at, the benefits that are coming from it. And also, when getting into communities of people that might not have those touch points, leaving them with some type of framework, some type of tools, so that when they're engaged in a conversation, they can either have the resources necessary to reach out, learn how to change the language around how they're speaking about people and speaking about things, finding the empathy, the compassion, and being able to relate that, we're all just trying to figure this out. Nobody has the answers, in this world. And I think that's what makes it so beautiful and leaves so much room for growth and potential. And so, yeah, we gotta get rid of the Shonda factor. No room for it.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks for your call to lead by example. Mark, I remember seeing that picture that you talked about on Facebook, and before we even get into what we can do in the future, I appreciate what you have done in the past. And yeah, what can we continue to do to destigmatize these conversations?
Thank you. There's a phrase in coaching, a framework of what are we celebrating and what are we still challenged by? And I think there's a ton that we can celebrate, like all the organizations that we're talking about, the Bamidbars, the Blue Dove Foundations, the Sellas, et cetera, et cetera. The fact that they exist is incredible. The fact that the pastoral education exists is incredible. The fact that many synagogues now have the dedicated mental health Shabbat is great. And I think those are all things that we get to celebrate and get to keep doing to maintain where we're at. And because there's always stuff that we can keep doing, I'd be curious to explore, well, would we still have stigmas around? So for example, let's say depression and anxiety, very comfortable having people on panels about. I was very pleasantly surprised that we had someone in recovery who's on a panel. When it comes to schizophrenia, when it comes to bipolar, when it comes to the more insignificant, air quotes, extreme mental health disorders, do we have the same conversations and relate to them in community in the same way? In Israel now, there's a movement that's really taking off where they're running holiday and Shabbat programming in psychiatric wards for Jewish patients. That's incredible. That conversation about, well, who's in the psychiatric ward and are we taking care of them in the same way? When we do a Mishaberach L'Cholim, a prayer on behalf of the ill, do we feel comfortable sharing mentally ill as long with the physically ill? And the reason why I raise that is because often on these panels, in a very appropriate way, we get to celebrate, look at how far we've come, and it's been tremendous. And if we're talking about where can we still have the opportunity to destigmatize, well, what are one of the questions I like to ask is, well, who isn't in the room and why not? And what are the things that have been brought up that might have made us a little bit uncomfortable when they were brought up? And what does that indicate? And how can we work through that? And I think this panel is a fantastic example of something that we can celebrate that's advancing the conversation in beautiful ways. And thank you, Rabbi Weinbach and Orla Tzedek and everyone here for organizing. It's really energizing to be surrounded by people doing the work and people who are calling in and learning and validating. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mark. And that's a great, honestly, a great note to end on. We're doing a lot, and also there's so much more left to be done. This feels like it's actually a step, like it's a push on our community, and there's a lot more work to continue doing. So to everyone watching this, figure out what it is that you can do. Think about the how mental illness is coming up in your life, in your family, and make it a priority to try to destigmatize these conversations in our community where they're still stigmatized. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, Ben, Dr. Friedman, Mark, Gabriella. It's really been a pleasure having this conversation with you today. I've learned a lot, and thank you so much for spending the time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you, everyone.
Absolutely.